Hello. Welcome to All That's Well. I'm your host, Darlene Ifill-Taylor, MD, and I'm really glad to be back on this week recording this podcast. The last 2 weeks have been difficult, and I did not do a podcast last week, staying true to myself, and so I'm really glad to be back with you. All That's Well is the podcast of Three Strand Wellness, which is a wellness center in Charlotte's Plaza Midwood. We seek at Three Strand not only to treat depression and anxiety, your mental health, but also to provide personal fitness training, yoga, meditation, massage, and Reiki for the wellness of the total person, body, mind, and spirit. Additionally, we provide community wellness talks to educate and inspire self-care and total wellness. Since COVID-19, Three Strand has moved to virtual yoga, virtual personal training, and telemental health. And we're really pleased to still be able to serve the community during this time of COVID-19. A number of our podcast listeners want to stay updated with what Three Strand is doing, so there it is. Today, however, I'd like to talk about our present state of national wellness. National, international, personal. This episode is called Staying Well When Enough is Enough. The past 2 weeks have been difficult for most of us out there, myself included. The death of George Floyd has impacted us severely as a nation. It's been a trauma, another trauma, superimposed on the trauma of COVID-19. So many of us are battle-weary, discouraged, angry. I, for one, am heartbroken. I'd like to introduce my co-discussant today, Mr. Joe Weston. Joe is an author and a peace activist who has taught peaceful interaction all over the country and, in fact, all over the world. His book is called Respectful Confrontation, and he's in the midst of his second book, and I'll ask him to talk some about that. And respectful confrontation is certainly an appropriate theme for these times. Joe, can you tell our listeners some about yourself and about your work? Welcome, Joe Weston.
Thank you, Darlene. It's great to be here and to do this with you. I'd love to talk about my work and my book. And so the book is called Mastering Respectful Confrontation. And I developed that because I was seeing it really comes from a fundamental question that I've always had all my life, which is, why is it, even though people know better, even though people are relatively intelligent and we have technology at our fingertips with the internet and all of that, why is it even though we know better, we still have arguments and fights?
Yes.
And on a larger scale, crime and war and hunger.
Yes.
And racial injustice and economic injustice.
Yes.
And that question's been with me all my life. And it feels very precious for me to be able to share that with you now, because even when I was a young boy, when I met you at 14 years old in Queens, New York.
So for our listeners, Joe and I have been lifelong friends.
Yes.
It's one of my besties.
I bring that up not only because you have been such a dear person in my life and a jewel and an anchor in my life, but the story starts there. Like, why do I have devoted my life to understanding conflict in a sense?
Yes.
And I always say it's because I'm a New Yorker. It started there because, as you know, just being a New Yorker every day is an examination of confrontation and conflict. Just getting on the subway and just getting to work or getting to school. So I've always been involved with that and concerned about that. And I mean, my story goes, I ended up in Europe and lived in the Netherlands for 18 years when I was 22. That happened when I was 22. And had the opportunity to work with people from around the world. And I always say that I learned a lot about who I am by taking the time and listening to other people's stories.
Sure.
That in everybody's story, just to hear their triumphs and their challenges, I got a chance to review what I believe to be true, and I have to realize that some of the things that I believe to be true, my very narrow New York City way of looking at things, was not the way it is. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, because you're living in this little microcosm, little bubble, right? And when you get out into the world and start listening to other people and listening to what's the same and what's different, and all, you realize it's a macrocosm is way bigger than what your experience has been. Sure. Sure.
I bring that up also because I think that's very pertinent for what's happening now. I mean, I can say as a white man and observing what's happening in this country and around the world, this is the sensitivity that we have to be aware of, is that not everybody understands that the way you perceive the world to be, what have you always believed to be true, that they may not be the full truth, or it might not be true at all. And it's very hard to let that go.
Yes. It's because you have a mindset, right? So I'm a psychiatrist, as you know, and I deal in the blind spots of people all the time. And one of the things I've noticed, it's so difficult it's because it's a blind spot, but it's so difficult for people to, one, be told that they have a blind spot, and two, then to consider what they have to do in order to no longer be blind in that spot. It's really hard.
Yeah.
It's hard
it's
work.
The same thing. I think I don't know a lot about addiction psychology and things like that, but just, a lot of the times we're attached to or addicted to some of the things that we believe.
Of course.
Whether it's what we believe about how the cops are or not, and all of that.
Yep.
And from what I understand, is that it's really hard to give up an addiction without replacing it with something that's healthier, or just having another alternative.
Sure.
That, I think that's part of what this is helping people find an alternative to their viewpoint that works, that can still work for them on some point, but also is more in alignment with what's truly happening.
And not the feeling that they have to give up everything that they've ever believed in order to take another viewpoint. And that's the threat, right? Because and that comes back to the very basic thing of, if I let this go, I might be annihilated. Like a very deep, basic trauma response. Sure. So you bring up the word trauma, and I wanted to talk to the listeners about trauma, because I said this when COVID-19 struck. I said, we sort of have an international trauma going on. And I don't know if people look at it the way I look at it, but it was very traumatic, and still is. So we see droves of people going out to the beach and not social distancing and that kind of thing, because at some point people are just like, I can't handle the trauma of I've got these are the things I've done my whole life in order to have enjoyment, or in order to cope, or in order to, I'm a psychiatrist, got to say, in order to not be with myself. Right. And so it's and something could just kill me, and it doesn't matter whether I'm young or old, or so it's very, very traumatic. And then we had Ahmaud Arbery, and then we had George Floyd. And George Floyd, I was speaking with my daughter, who didn't like that it was the film was shown so often. And I said to her, we have the choice to look away, and I've looked at it only once. My sensitivities can't take it beyond that. But I did say to her that this time maybe it needed to be shown as often as it was shown. Although it is traumatizing, there are some, I don't want to say there are some traumas that are good. That's not what I mean. But there are some realities that, although they're traumatizing, need to be known.
Well, I would say that I see the similar thing. The image that I would use, that I actually use in situations, just as a metaphor, not a literal thing, is a defibrillator.
Yeah.
Is that it's a traumatic experience getting electric shock like that, but it revives the system, right? So sometimes if the system is in that level of trauma, or that level of distress, that sometimes that kind of, it's not matching it with the same level of animosity or malice, but that you have to match it with the same kind of energy or frequency to just shock it back into awakeness.
Yeah, sometimes if the system is dying. And so in part I wanted to do this show today because they're just because we're not talking about something doesn't mean it's not happening, and doesn't mean it's not devastating people, and doesn't mean it is not affecting our national or international or community and thus individual wellness. It just doesn't mean that. It's not. And so this just made it that we now are talking about it. And I have to say that I've been encouraged by, I saw a picture of you out there on the front line, sitting, leading a meditation on the ground, and I've just been so encouraged by the protests, and hopefully people starting to see that protesting is an important and healthy way for human beings to speak to something that's just not right, and how would we have change without it, and that all protesting is not the same thing as rioting, that there is peaceful protest, and peaceful interaction is something that you have taught. I mean, you've been in so many places over the years, teaching this, and I have a song that's called "Free Again." And you kind of fell in love with the song. You could be biased, and you play that. And
I am. If I'm not your number one fan, I'm certainly in the top 10.
You're in there. And so you can certainly get the song on iTunes if you all are interested out there. And you started to play the song wherever you went in the world, giving these talks and teachings. And you'd play it before you, and you'd write to me. I'd get a text that would say, "Free again in Bethlehem," "Free again in Jerusalem," and it's
literally those places. Yes.
Yes, and it's always, as you know, completely warms my heart. But can you just tell us some about what your teachings, the workshops that you do? Tell us what you're trying to teach us, teach human beings. And I see what you're trying to teach is very in alignment with the wellness principles that I'm trying to espouse and have people to espouse. So can you tell us about it?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Wow. So I'm going to do it from try to touch a little bit on the perspective from the nonviolence kind of peaceful perspective of it, non-aggression piece of it. There's also the nervous system and work that I'm doing in trauma healing work as well. So we'll see which way we go with that. But so the work Respectful Confrontation is this idea of training people to develop the courage and the skills to stand in your power, speak your truth, get your needs met in a way where you don't harm people and you don't get harmed and other people don't get harmed.
Right.
And it's a process that's about theory, about how to speak more effectively in difficult situations. But it's also based on my martial arts background and background in a lot of Eastern philosophies, particularly Tai Chi and Aikido, which are softer martial arts. And I'm sure.
Yes.
And that's where I began to learn about the connection between mind and body, and that you can separate the physical body, the emotional body, the mental body, or the spiritual body.
Yes.
They're all one being
interconnected
within ourselves, and they're interconnected. And that's a way of looking at it, is like, how am I nurturing my physical body today? How am I nurturing my emotional body today?
Yes.
How am I nurturing my mental body and my spiritual body?
Yes.
And that's just a way of referencing it. So I really understood mind body. So the work is very somatic. So that meaning that you're not just learning theory, you're actually getting into the body. What does it mean to start training your body to be resilient? So really rewiring the nervous system to be able to hold center. Sure. And not get reactive when you're in moments of crisis and stress, and that can be, for everyone, is different. It could be literally being exposed to an international pandemic.
Yes.
It could be racial violence.
Yes.
It could be having to talk to your boss about that you believe you need a raise. Like, everyone's level of how they respond to stress is different.
Yes.
And the training is to be able to hold that. And that's where the new book and the new work is coming in, which is called Fierce Civility. So where the Respectful Confrontation is more about confronting others, and more importantly, on a deeper level, confronting yourself, like you were saying.
Yes.
The capacity to sit with yourself and actually have loving, open-hearted, respectful conversations with the parts of you don't like to think about or be connected with, to find healing within yourself.
Right. Right,
that's the respectful comfort. The fierce civility is, how can we now, the world is calling us to step up with a deeper level of critical thinking, communicating in a civil way,
Yes.
and getting more civically engaged.
Yes.
And when I say civically engaged, when I say love thy neighbor, for me, it's every human being on this planet becomes our neighbor.
That's right.
So that there's no way at this time that we cannot see that we are all interconnected.